It's been 6.5 years since the Malaysian Airlines MH370 disappeared en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, China, with a presumed loss of all 239 on board. And yet, despite the most expensive air and sea search in aviation history and the launching of a whole raft of conspiracy theories, only a few fragments of the plane have been discovered, thousands of kilometres away on the other side of the Indian Ocean. But the aircraft's actual location is still a mystery. So considering all the effort that has gone into the recovery mission and the research into all the things that we've found out since, why can't we find MH370? This video is sponsored by Brilliant. The loss of MH370 has become one of the biggest mysteries in aviation history since the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan in the Central Pacific whilst trying to circumnavigate the globe in 1937. But whereas Earhart's disappearance was thought of as a tragic accident, the loss of MH370 has boiled down to two possible outcomes. Firstly, something happened to the crew that incapacitated them and the plane flew on by itself until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea soon after. How it ended up in the Indian Ocean when it was flying north to China still isn't explained by this scenario. The second is that someone on board took control of the aircraft and deliberately flew it to a remote part of the Indian Ocean and ditched the plane. Either of these outcomes is disconcerting. If the crew were incapacitated and the plane was left to fly by itself, then it would be imperative to try and find out the cause. If, however, it was a case of hijacking or pilot suicide and the murder of all on board, then the ramifications would also be worse for Malaysia as a whole. To many Malaysians, it's almost unthinkable that a well-respected pilot of the national flag carrier could do such a thing. And in Asian culture, loss of face is one of the worst things that can happen. This highlights the problem that MH370 poses. We just don't know where it went down. But in order to try and find that out, we need to know where it was in its final few hours. Based on the evidence so far, it's believed to be somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, around an area defined by a set of radio messages sent from a maintenance system that was never in any way designed to be a location device, and assuming that it flew at altitude until it ran out of fuel. Because there was no direct GPS tracking data sent from the aircraft, its final course and location had to be reconstituted from data picked up by the Inmarsat satellite, which received hourly maintenance broadcasts from the plane's ACARS data link system. In the time from receiving the last transmission to the crash, which could have been anything from a few minutes to almost an hour, the plane could have flown on for hundreds of kilometres. By comparing the timing delay from the ACARS system to it arriving at the satellite situated over the Indian Ocean, the Inmarsat engineers were able to determine a possible route along the so-called Seventh Arc that stretched from Central Asia to the north to the Southern Oceans in the south and passing about 2,000 kilometres west of Perth, Australia. Ruling out the northern path due to a lack of radar evidence from the countries that it would have had to have flown over left the southern route as the most probable. The data pings also continued for a further 6 hours after the military radar lost contact with it over Indonesian airspace, meaning that it must have been in the air and operational during this time. The issue of how MH370 ended up in the sea also has an impact on where the wreckage is likely to be. If the aircraft was flying at a high altitude and on autopilot without a crew and ran out of fuel, then it's likely to have ended up in a high-speed dive. In similar accidents like the 1998 crash of Swissair 111 into the Atlantic, the effect of the high-speed impact with the sea resulted in the plane breaking up into over 2 million pieces. If MH370 did the same, then there will be very few large pieces left to float away, and the distance travelled from the time the engines flamed out to hitting the sea would have been quite short. In simulator tests, it's thought to have been up to about 37 kilometres. If, however, the plane was in a pilot-controlled glide from a point of running out of fuel to making a controlled landing in the sea relatively intact, simulator tests showed that distance could be up to 130 kilometres. But this is assuming that the pilot waited until it ran out of fuel. He could have just ditched the plane whilst it was still under power and before the fuel ran out to give the greatest chance of keeping the aircraft intact. But either of these scenarios could place it at a considerable distance from the initial search area. By analysing the Inmarsat data and knowing the amount of fuel the aircraft was carrying, a search area of approximately 1.12 million square kilometres was defined. This was later prioritised down to 120,000 square kilometres. From the 18th of March to the 29th of April 2014, 21 aircraft flew 345 flights with a combined flight time of over 3,177 hours, together with 19 ships from 8 countries. The initial belief by the ATSB, the Australian Transport Safety Board, which led the search, was that the crew were incapacitated by a hypoxia event, like a sudden decompression, and that the plane had flown on autopilot until the engines had flamed out due to lack of fuel. But this still had to take on major assumptions such as it was flying in a straight line and at altitude, either of which could have been wrong and could make a huge difference to where it really is. But this scenario defined the initial search area, which has been subject to underwater sonar scans in 2014 and has been the basis for all subsequent searches. However, investigators in the US and Europe believe the evidence points towards a manual controlled takeover of the aircraft to flight into the southern Indian Ocean, an area renowned for rough seas, high winds and deep ocean floors. And as the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott said, it's about as close to nowhere as it's possible to be. Part of this conclusion comes from the course the aircraft took shortly after the last verbal communication with air traffic control and what happened next. All the data transmissions from the aircraft were suddenly lost along with all communications, pointing to someone turning off the main electrical power systems and then relying upon the emergency ram air turbine to provide just enough power to fly the aircraft, whilst keeping to a very careful and well thought out course following the Thai-Malaysian border into the Straits of Malacca before turning towards the southern oceans. This was done very carefully to avoid other aircraft and raising the concerns of the multiple civilian and military air traffic controllers in the area. Once it was in the Indian Ocean and out of Indonesian radar range, power seems to have been partially reinstated as the ACAR system started working again. This scenario was given added significance some 16 months later with the discovery of an almost intact starboard flaperon, something which crash investigators say would have been ripped apart by a high-speed impact with the sea. This was based on previous high-speed impacts like the Swissair 111 and computer modelling of how the flaperon would have reacted in varying crash scenarios. The flaperon was also damaged in such a way as to indicate that it was extended at the time, something which would have only been done during a pilot-controlled landing and if the aircraft had power. Only the trailing edge was eroded, which suggests it was caused by hitting the sea during a ditching of the aircraft. Then there was the discovery of a flight path found on a computer simulator at the home of the pilot, which followed a very similar path ending up in the approximate area of where it's believed to have disappeared. There were about 1,000 other flight paths found on the simulator, but only one where the destination was the Southern Ocean, well away from any possible place to land. 32 pieces of debris have been found that could be linked to MH370, but only 3 have been positively identified. All these were found on coasts thousands of kilometres away on the other side of the Indian Ocean, which is pretty much where they're expected to be, knowing how the currents flow around from the east to west. No pieces have been found on the Australian coast, even though it is much closer to the presumed crash site than where they ended up. Experts say this proves that it had to have come down in an area where the ocean current flows away from Australia and over to the western Indian Ocean. But whether that was much farther north or south of the ATSB's estimate remains unknown. The barnacle growth found on the flaperon would have only occurred if it had been in the warm waters further north for an extended period of time, leading some at the Royal Aeronautical Society to suggest that it could have been trying to land at Christmas Island, but ran out of fuel due to flying at a much lower altitude of 5,000 feet and a slower speed since leaving the Straits of Malacca rather than into the southern Indian Ocean. This is based on their extensive and exclusive investigation of the air traffic control responses from all the countries involved and the unusual course it took during the first part of the flight after the radar contact was lost and it entering the Indian Ocean. But backtracking the debris from their final position to try and locate where they entered the ocean years earlier is a very imprecise science and can only give a general area over such long time spans, and it doesn't rule out a more northerly or southerly crash location. During the initial search and to direct submersible vehicles to the sea floor to take a closer look, high-resolution images of the ocean topography were required, not only to know where they were going, but also to know how deep they were. In the initial aftermath, some remote subs were sent to below their design depth simply because of the poor accuracy of their existing maps. Although we have maps of all the ocean floors, most of these come from gravitational maps created from satellite data, which have a resolution of around about 2 kilometers per pixel. A greater accuracy of 300 meters per pixel is available from satellite-mounted radar altimeters, but this is still far too low resolution to find even the largest parts of an aircraft a few tens of meters in size. Due to the remoteness, bad weather and lack of commercial interest in the southern oceans, there have been very little in the way of high-resolution mapping done. What we do know is that the rugged ocean terrain in this area could easily hide an object like an aircraft, even one the size of a Boeing 777. To find something as small as an aircraft, especially if it's broken up into smaller pieces, requires high-resolution scanning equipment such as side scanning and multi-beam sonar. In the search, these were towed behind ships which travelled 24/7 across the search area. As the image data was coming in live, anything found that could be of interest was marked so that autonomous submersibles could be sent down to investigate. Although the underwater survey revealed a huge amount about the ocean floor in the area of the search, nothing from MH370 was found, and the joint Malay, Chinese and Australian search was eventually wound up in January 2017. In October 2017, the company Ocean Infinity offered to search for MH370 on a no-find, no-fee basis for the Malaysian government, and on the next most likely area based on drift analysis conducted by CISRO, the Australian National Science Agency. This new search area is a bit farther south and based on the ocean currents which travel towards Africa, where all the existing wreckage was found. In 2018, using the vessel Seabed Constructor and its 8 autonomous underwater vehicles, Ocean Infinity searched 120,000 square kilometres over 3 months, discovering more about the ocean floor and several shipwrecks at a depth of 3,700 to 3,900 metres and dating back to the 19th century, but again, no sign of the missing plane. And this is where we currently are. So could we find MH370 if we really tried? I certainly think so. We've already ruled out certain areas so we know where it isn't. We could start searching to the north where the Royal Aeronautical Society think it is, or to the south where the US investigators think it may be. But either way, this would cover a very large area and there's still no guarantee. So the sticking point now seems to be money. Malaysia is happy for third parties to restart the search on limited areas, but on a no-find, no-fee basis, so there will be no blank checks to look for it until found. $200 million has already been spent on the search so far, making it the most expensive in aviation history. The 2018 search by Ocean Infinity would have cost the Malaysian government $70 million if they had found the aircraft. So, working on that basis, to produce a high-resolution search of 1,000,000 square kilometres would cost in the region of about $500 million and maybe take a couple of years, even if other ships were to join in the search. If we really wanted to find MH370 come what may, and you had to perform a high-resolution search of a large chunk of the eastern Indian Ocean west of Australia before locating it, several $1 billion might be needed. But I wouldn't place any bets on that happening anytime soon, unless a benevolent billionaire decides to pitch in with some funding. If MH370 is in the sea, then the only way we're going to find it in the deep ocean is with advanced sonar. But this is a slow process, with each sonar unit only being able to travel around about 4 kilometers per hour. In recent years, advances in AUVs or autonomous underwater vehicles has allowed multiple units to work together as a group, covering a much greater area in the same time, essential for the large searches like MH370. These advances need skilled technicians not only to develop them but also to operate them. And the one way you can build up your skills is by using something like Brilliant, the sponsors of this video. Brilliant is a problem-solving website and app, so you're not tied to the desktop and you can develop those skills anywhere. Basically, Brilliant breaks down complex problems into small, easily understandable parts before putting them back together to show the overall conclusion. There are loads of great interactive courses and daily challenges covering everything from math and logic to quantum objects and computer science, and loads of other things in between. This hands-on active learning approach is great for all you curious minds out there who want to understand the world. So if you want to support Curious Droid and get unlimited access to all of Brilliant's in-depth courses and learning, head on over to brilliant.org/Curious Droid to get 20% off of our annual premium subscription. And to just round things off, I would just like to say a big thank you to all our patrons for their ongoing support.